Don, you're muted. We can't hear you. Sorry.
Sorry, I, just a bit nervous. Yep. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next Art in Conversation seminar that the International Association of Synaesthete Artists and Scientists and Scientists is organizing in generous and creative partnership with the University of St. Andrews. Today, we will be focusing on synesthesia as it deploys its mechanisms in visual arts. In the strand of synesthesia research, this is a rather generic and oldie topic, but we have made an attempt to pump new blood and invite artists who are new to the synesthesia community. I feel really thrilled and delighted to introduce our first speakers today, who's Lucy Engelman, an American author and performance artist and filmmaker who has the phenomenon of synesthesia, which enriches her perceptual pathways and enables her to taste colors, smell sounds, and experience verbal information as a spectrum of vibrant colors. We also have with us today Lucy Engelman's husband, Scottish painter Daniel Mullen, whose visual art aims to question dominating modes of perception through meaningfully designed compositions, mimicking and reconsidering contemporary digital renderings. Daniel had several solo exhibitions in Italia, Brazil, the Netherlands, and other countries, and his works can be found in institutional and private collections. Daniel and Lucy decided to translate Lucy's complex sensory world in a way that might be easier to understand for those of us who do not see days and numbers in color. The collaboration started as a set of paintings entitled A Different Kind of Time, Sequencing Spatial Temporal Synesthesia. Much in Daniel's signature style, it resulted in works that might appear as digital renderings. However, upon a closer look, they reveal the materiality and living imperfections. I am certain that there is an interesting and even romantic story behind this collaborative project, and it has intriguing spin-offs and follow-ups. So, Lucy, thank you so much. Daniel, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today. And please share your synesthesia experience in art with us, and feel free to share your screens and talk to our audience. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and lovely to be here.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and lovely to be here. Yeah, it is a bit of a romantic beginning. I met Daniel at an artist residency and was really struck by the visual language that he was already using. And I actually thought, oh, he must have synesthesia. This is really the way that I see space and time. And I actually never seen it visualized so clearly. At that point, I think I was 28, and I only had known about synesthesia since I was around 20. I didn't know that, of course, not as so common that people have it, and you don't know it's not normal, or that not everyone sees the world that way. And it actually had never even crossed my mind to try to visually express it or bring it into the world in a kind of material sense, because it was so innate in my consciousness, and it really triggered this kind of like opening door of possibility artistically. I had never even looked up art synesthesia as a combination. So that was a really interesting beginning, and I approached Daniel, and he didn't have synesthesia, but we started talking about it, and kind of the early beginnings of the collaboration were born. And maybe I can share my screen now, and we can start to, I don't know if Daniel wants to also jump in speaking about the early paintings and how we developed them, but we focused specifically on time, visualizing time. I actually don't, in your intro, you mentioned that I have the sensing colors, tastes, and sounds. I wish I did. I don't have that. But I have more the grapheme, letters, numbers, abstract symbols in color, and then very much the spatial temporal with time, days of the week, months of the year, and just like a full visual spectrum of that. So I'll share my screen and
Hi everyone, this is Daniel. Maybe I can introduce how the paintings are constructed a little bit, so we have that as an introduction to what we're seeing. The paintings are all acrylic paint on linen canvas, and the canvas is prepared with a translucent acrylic binder as a way to seal the linen before the painting is created. The painting you're seeing right in front of you is one of the first paintings, and they're created through basically creating an architectural drawing with pencil, and then starting to outline with acrylic paint and paper tape all the shapes, and then filling those in with a translucent layer of acrylic paint. This was, I think, maybe like the third painting that we ever did. This was back in 2017, I believe, like April or something. And what we were looking to do, so when I first met Lucy, I'd never heard of synesthesia, and I was incredibly fascinated by this other, as a visual artist, like another way of looking and seeing and experiencing the world. So I was incredibly fascinated when Lucy told me that the way she looked at my paintings was almost it was a synesthetic experience for her. I was very curious to see how we could combine my way of painting with how her experience of the world. So we started to try and define in a way a way of communicating between us that I could understand to a certain degree how she was experiencing the world, and that I could then translate that into a painting. So each painting at the beginning was in a way a sort of an attempt to try to grasp how Lucy was experiencing it. And of course, Lucy has to speak more about this, but from how I understood it, it was like it could be experienced from multiple dimensions. So this is a painting of time, and what you'll see is there's like 4 bands of colors. The one furthest away from us is you'll see it's got like white, blue, yellow, pink, etc., going through again to white, and each one of those lines represents a year. And then the line in front of that, closer to us, it's hard to see, but there are groups of 10, and so each one of those lines, thanks Lizzie, each one of those lines represents a year as well, but they're in groups of 10, so it's decades. And then the row in front of that is the hundreds, so that's and then the row in front of that is the thousands. So that lighter blue, that light blue actually represents 1. The darker navy blue behind it represents 9 for Lucy, and then you'll see the decades behind that. So if you were able to grab this whole thing with your hands, and you would try and break it apart, and you would hold it like a sausage in front of you, then you would see a year. So like 1948, for example. So all of these, if you slice it at any moment, is actually a different year. And then maybe Lucy should start explaining how that works.
Thanks, Daniel. So
Lucy, sorry, you're muted.
Thanks, Daniel. So in the beginning, this was a really interesting process to try to translate what I was seeing, what was in my mind's eye and my brain onto the canvas. And it took a lot of like kind of trial and error. And you'll see that in the paintings that we show after this. Maybe I can already move on to the next one, possibly. So this was like a next iteration, because yeah, we were really honing in on wanting to visualize centuries. So we were thinking, okay, so this is how I'm seeing and experiencing. For instance, this is 2000, the zero, and the early decades. So this is kind of our future, say, because this is the decades of the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. So this would be what's coming up for us. And a thing for me that was really important was, what are the specific colors? How am I locating the shape? And how am I emphasizing that we can orient from any multiplicitous perspective? It's not just from the side like this. We can be above it, we can be below it, we can be to the left of it, we can zoom in, we can zoom out. And then at the final phase was kind of also in how do we make it a good painting? Can't just be this literal translation. We also have to consider form and color in a way that's going to be visually have some kind of power or agency as well. And for me, these kind of panes of glass, if you will, is how we started to film, started to really solidify as the best way to translate what is in my brain, of course, a little bit more intangible and a little bit more amorphous. Of course, it's always the same. It's inherent in how I perceive time, but it is almost, of course, nearly impossible to directly translate. So we took some artistic liberty in that process of creating the work as well. And here I think is a really nice example of like this line right here is this kind of split, like, okay, so this is 2045 right there, which is in the future. And you can kind of see the slicing happening and then the kind of zooming down into the future, zooming back into the past. But we could flip this painting entirely upside down and also perceive time that way too, where we would be facing around, facing the past with the future behind us. Then this one, moving on to, we took that approach of just being entirely above time and feeling it below us. And this is the split of the century. And here you have a great example where typically we read left to right, but here we flipped it because this is the past. So we're reading right to left. And we have, this is the late 1900s. So we have 1999 to 2000. The zeros are always white. Here's the year 2000. So we have that kind of Y2K moment happening. And then this is all the time that we've just been experiencing. And you can kind of like fall through it. I think that was also really important, that there was this transparency where it wasn't these solid blocks, but that you had a feeling of whoosh, whoosh, space, time. There's no gravity here. There's no earthly bounds. We're kind of flying in and out of it, and really can get up close. And so, yeah, maybe should we show the video of how it was created? Daniel made a really beautiful stop motion of how he was making this painting in particular, which I can share. Let's see. Oh, hold up. I need to choose to share it, I think, on my, where is it? So bear with me just a moment. Stop sharing and then share the because process matters. Yeah. Does that everyone see that? Okay, great. We'll just
Yes.
play it off. Okay.
But we can't hear anything.
There's no sound. Yeah,
Okay.
just a visual. Yeah.
So of course there's different forms of synesthesia, and it's kind of interesting that it becomes, when it becomes like a stop motion, it also becomes, when you see it then in this in a stop motion version, then it almost feels like it becomes like a musical expression, visualization, which is I always find quite interesting. Yeah. Do you want to share your screen again, Lucy?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Share. ABC. Yeah, so that video, it goes by quickly, but it shows the whole process and how many steps there are to it that are very labor intensive. So at that moment, I think we kind of had a pause, if I recall, where I was feeling like this isn't quite maybe visually something we're as interested in. It felt a little too didactic, or like on the nose, if I recall a little. We wanted to get a bit more potent and powerful with the work as paintings. They were feeling a bit too much like illustrations. And even in that, I was chafing at how they weren't quite right. Like, it's not quite how I'm seeing it. So we moved into a kind of different perspective. So this work, Daniel, I don't know if you want to talk about this one at all.
So this one is called Crossing a Century, and it was just, in a way, we started thinking about it as starting to zoom into the work, into the, let's say, the physical space of time, and we started looking at like, okay, what happens when we are like inside this crossing of a century? So this would be the yellow represents the two, so the 2000s, the dark blue is then the 1900s, and it's almost like you're looking behind you and in front of you simultaneously, like you're inside it. And so we started, in a way, starting to try and find a more formalistic form in order for the paintings to somehow operate autonomously and not just as an illustration of an expression of perception. And we also started to think about the saturation of color as well, the intensity. So the color became that experience of color in relationship to what it was representing for Lucy became way more important than the architecture to a certain degree. So here we started focusing on the century, crossing a century, and later on, we literally just started focusing on the decades. And there was something interesting for me as a painter about focusing on the decades, was that you had these overlaps. Maybe we can go on to slide 6. We had overlaps of, so this is like the decades. So the far left is 0, far right is also 0. So then it goes 10s, 20s, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90s, it's dark blue, and then it's back to the zeros again. So that's like a century. And so when you have these groups of 10, you start to be able to do these overlaps, build up saturations of color, depth, and also some interesting rhythms as well. So for the painter in me, I find this a very interesting exploration, investigation into form and color and rhythm, which was also interesting that there was like a certain level of autonomy in the interpretation of Lucy's synesthetic experience.
And the wonderful thing for me as well was that it was much more true to how I experienced it at the same time, because it always does have that overlapping blending between the colors unless a number is a solo digit alone, it always impacts the digit next to it. And so I loved how this started to really feel simultaneously more exciting for Daniel and more true for me. It was really nice in that way. And this is, just to clarify, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a cryptic. I'm not sure. Not a diptych. Yeah, so it's five canvases. Yeah. Yeah, so I can move on to this work. So this is the edge of the 40s. So we've got the last 4 years of the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. A very important time in world history, and that felt also, this work, I should say, was kind of maybe like a seminal work that really kind of, finally we've arrived, like this is okay, here we are. And we've made many different variations of this composition and colors, and it was really beautiful to see how people responded and how it was received. And I think it felt like finally, okay, it's starting to sing in this. It's still one of my favorites of the whole series, I think. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to mention about it. Okay. Yeah, this one now we're reorienting, but with the same, and you start to get this beautiful curve, which is there in this other formation, but somehow it becomes more visually comes to the forefront more, this kind of hourglass, which I think is so metaphorically funny, completely unintentional and by chance that this arrives. And we also kind of thought of it as like these, there's like almost these butterfly wings, but this is the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And again, I should say this could be any century. It could be 1000 AD or 3000. But of course, because we haven't lived, or this is a future, but I was always feeling that, okay, it was the 1900s or something, because that felt also kind of like time periods that you revisit a lot in your mind from history and school and just what's happening. So yeah, I kind of found it for myself always located, but it really could be any decade, or any decade in any century. And then we arrived. Oh, I don't know what's happening here. There's like an error in the PDF. This is not how it should look at all. Do you want to?
Those horizontal lines shouldn't be there. The vertical lines are all correct, but those other lines are. It's a digital intervention in the painting.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe
Yeah.
that's also a way to develop the work as well. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about this one?
Not so much. I mean, it's just we basically then also started working with scale as well. So like this painting is it's a diptych, and each panel is I believe 2 meters 40 long by 2.5 meter high. So it's definitely a physical experience to be standing in front of this work, and we did quite a few of these works. That it's almost like it gets to a scale that when you start to walk by it from left to right, then you also in a way are walking through time. So we didn't go into the 3 dimensions, it was still 2 dimensions, but like it definitely started to operate in a more physical realm, not just a mental space in a way, which was very interesting. And so we worked in this series for I think about 4 years, and we've kind of at this moment we've laid it to rest. And one of the last projects we did was we started looking at, okay, so we've we've been looking at centuries. We've been focusing on centuries, but of course, for Lucy, her synesthetic experience isn't limited to time as in years, but that also is in minutes, days, months, and that's a whole different color spectrum, and also how that synesthetic experience operates. So there's a different movement involved, and that brings us then to one of the final series we actually made, or the final works we made, which is called the Days of the Week. So what you'll see here is 7 panels, and then maybe I can let Lucy explain more about how that operated.
So this was an attempt to, visualize the days of the week. We have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and they kind of exist. They never exist as isolated entities. I never think about Monday just as like a solo individual, whereas I might think of a digit or a letter as a solo individual. I never think about Monday without feeling and sensing Tuesday and Sunday on its edges. So that was really important in these works to kind of still consider the other colors and days of the weeks on the edges of each work, and then that it's kind of this rotation of one coming to the forefront, what the day that we're in, the feeling, and then moving on to like the next day coming forward, and the previous day receding a little bit but still being there, and et cetera, et cetera. And I can clarify that the way that I visualize a week or being within a week is the same feeling as years and centuries and decades, but where you can really orient from any perspective. It can be to the right of me, to the left of me, above, below, etc., as I think is quite common for people with spatial temporal synesthesia. But the colors, that you kind of really feel fully immersed. As opposed to often with centuries or years, I feel that I'm looking at it from somewhere, even the year that I might be in. But with the days of the week and when I'm in a day, I feel like, okay, I'm in this chamber of color, and it's like I'm swimming in it, kind of. So here you feel, yes, but I'm still seeing the other colors throughout. It's again, the transparency being really important. So we created a little, you want to say something?
I just want to clarify one thing, that each of the 7 panels, they include all 7 colors that represent each day of the week. So if you look closely, if you would zoom in, for example, on, let's say, okay, this one, then you'll see that all 7 colors are present, but it's just a question of what one is. It's like a carousel, right? So it's just about what one is closest to us from our perspective. And if you shift over to the next one, for example, you'll see green in the green. Green is a good one. So far right, you'll see a little bit of green. In the one where the cursor now is, you'll see green, and then as you go further over, it's coming closer and closer to you, and then it suddenly recedes and recedes. So it's like, and the green is Wednesday. So it's like green is the day of Wednesday is coming closer to you, and then you're in the day of Wednesday, so that's the green one, and then it starts to recede away from you again. So it's like you're in this carousel.
That's really important, that you can see it even like the tiniest little moment, and then it hops up, suddenly it's on the other side as a tiny moment. So it's tiny.
Yeah, so tiny. Sorry to interrupt, but we're just running out of time. So if you just want to conclude, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just show this little GIF of them on a carousel, and maybe I need to share that specific screen, and then we can do the it's like this, and then you could just see it go through like that. We made a little animation of it. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel and Lucy. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. We'll get back to it during the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we are now passing to our second speaker. It's Dasha Pierce. She's an award-winning artist, currently based in Helsinki, Finland. In her work, Dasha uses the instruments of surrealism, minimalism, color, photography, and digital manipulation. Since 2010, her works have been exhibited numerous times across the world in countries like Germany, France, Spain, United Kingdom, and United States. For her artworks, she received prestigious art and photography awards, among them the Smithsonian Magazine Award and a gold medal from the Photographic Society of America. Today, her art pieces are in over 100 private collections worldwide, including those in London, Paris, New York, Austin, and other cities. Dasha's creations are owned by expert art lovers working for Sotheby's, Harvard Art Museum, and Obama Foundation. Dasha, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to host you today. So please feel free. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. It's amazing to be here with you, and it was incredibly interesting to listen to Lucy and her husband. It was just enlightening. I have a lot of questions actually. But I will try to introduce my work quickly, and I can say a few words about how I found out about my synesthesia. It was actually about only 4 years ago. I was listening to an interview with a neuroscientist, and I think it was I might be messing up the name, but it's V.S. Ramachandran. So he's studying the brain, and he was referring to those people with synesthesia who see letters and colors, and I was like, okay, it's not normal. So I basically my whole life I just thought that everyone was like that, and I didn't pay attention to this very much. But when I discovered that I had this peculiarity, sort of, I decided to incorporate it into my work. And now I will share my screen probably, and just to show you a little bit of what I work on in general, and then I will introduce the specific project, which is called Synaesthetic Letters, which was basically inspired by my synesthesia. Yeah, do you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. So I work in a style which I call psychorealism. And by this, I mean that I try to look into human psyche and bring out everything that is hidden and sort of make the hidden reality of human minds real. For this, I use the instruments of surrealism, and that's why my works, they are kind of the expression of reality of what's going on in our minds. That can be thoughts, worries, anxieties, feelings, emotions, and whatnot. So there are a few examples of my works, and yeah. I want to tell you just a little more about the project that I think will most interest you. It's called Synaesthetic Letters, and as I mentioned, it was inspired by the case that I discovered synesthesia in me. And when it happened, I started asking my friends, like all people around me, basically all my family, in search of people who had the same phenomenon, because I found it really, really hard to believe that it's possible that I'm like very different from other people. And indeed, I found one person who became my collaborator for this project, and her name is Jane Christopherson. She lives in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and she is a stylist. So we created the synesthetic alphabet consisting of 26 letters by organizing 26 photo shoots. And we wanted to communicate to the rest of the world, basically, the way we see letters and colors. And also, while working on this project, I discovered more facts about synesthesia, and I think the underlying idea about this was not even to share how we see the world, but to maybe call to everyone who comes by this that we all perceive the reality in a different way, and it's really, really hard to predict that the person next to you is like seeing seeing the reality just quite the same way as you do. And that's why probably we need to take that into consideration when making judgments, or maybe skip judgments altogether and just accept that it can be very, very different from for other people, a bit more tolerance and understanding. So these are the letters. I will show you them as well one by one. So they were actually each and every one of them, there's very little Photoshop involved. Of course there is, but we try to make it as real as possible. And since also Jane and both of us, I haven't mentioned, but both of us, we have the grapheme, I think it's just grapheme numeric, is it, synesthesia? So we see letters and colors. I also see numbers and colors, as well as days of the week, days of the month, names of the months, and names of people are also colored for me. I also have this time synesthesia connected with the time, but not as vivid as Lucy's, but I do perceive the calendar in a different way as well. So not all of them, unfortunately, have some backstage shots, but just for you to see how it was. And to mention, we don't see letters in the same, of course, colors. And sometimes we had to argue a lot about which letter should have which color. And also there is a peculiarity that English is not my native language, nor it's Jane's. So our first language is Russian, and we do perceive colors differently for both alphabets. So it was interesting in terms of understanding how, for example, we have letter C in Russian as well, but it stands for letter S in English alphabet, and how the letter is actually like it can be different colors in different alphabets, although the shape is the same for different people. It's very interesting to just to discover how it is. And yeah, those were the moments. The project took us about 3 years, and we do live in different countries, so we had to collaborate basically across the border. All of it was shot and made in Russia because of like technical, actually it is easier, technically it was easier to make it there. And some of the shots were made in the studio, some of them were made on location, just like that. That was on a roof of a building, actually. We had it was challenging to communicate about different aspects of how we want to portray each and every letter. And sometimes we had to reshoot letters as well, because they just didn't, let's say, look readable. And also the purpose there was to, not the purpose, but one of the main goals was to have always like to have a human figure. So we're also humanizing the alphabet. It's kind of, I think, it first came unconsciously because I always utilize some human presence in my work. And that's why we're turning people into letters. Another feature of the project was that we wanted to put letters against some color background as well. Though personally, I don't see letters in color on a colored background. I just attribute a color to them. We thought that that would be a better artistic solution in this case. So yeah, I think this is it about the project, and I think I'm I'm done presenting my work, and I will be happy to get some questions if you have them at the end of the talk.
We will invite the audience's questions after our third speaker's talk. And for me, it's an honor to introduce my colleague from the University of Bristol, an award-winning professor of psychological science and the head of the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol. Please meet Michael Benessy. He has expertise in several research areas, including synesthesia, of course, but also mirror-touch synesthesia, multisensory and social perception, creativity, and empathy. Among many of his research topics is, as I said, mirror-touch synesthesia, and his most recent project was the Touch Test, a science and broadcast collaboration with the BBC4 and Wellcome collection. This spring, Michael published his first book, released both in the UK and USA. Over the course of his career, Michael published prolifically on the issues of cognitive, perceptual, and personality traits, as well as structural brain differences in people with synesthesia. He has received awards from the British Psychological Society and the European Society of Cognitive Psychology for outstanding contributions to psychological research. Michael, thank you for your generosity, and please feel free to take over and talk to our audience.
Thanks so much, Anton. Thank you. That was really kind introduction, very kind words. And thanks just to yourself and everyone for hosting the event, and also to all of the other speakers beforehand. That's been really fascinating. So yeah, I'm going to try and share my screen to start off, and then I'll take us from there. So just give me 1 second while I try and do that. Okay, can you see everything now?
Yeah, that looks great now. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's great. So hopefully just the slides, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me to begin with. As Anton mentioned, my name is Michael. I'm a social neuroscientist and a professor of psychology based at the University of Bristol. And I was asked today to give you a brief overview, I would say, about synesthesia, wider traits, and how they relate to art from my kind of perspective as someone who studies the brain basis of perception and the psychological mechanisms that play a role in that. And so I'm going to try and do this very, very briefly, hopefully to leave plenty of room for questions. And what I'm really going to try and do in the talk is to outline to you a few areas where there are, I suppose, wider differences in synesthesia, for instance, personality, creativity, empathy, and try and just explore a little bit about how those might impact on either artistic production or artistic experience, so engagement with art and how art might move us, how it might make us feel. Normally, when I give a talk like this, I would start by explaining what synesthesia is, but I feel that in this crowd, we've got a pretty good knowledge, obviously, of this really fascinating experience where often those senses that aren't normally connected come together. They merge in some way. And when I joined the scene as a synesthesia researcher, probably I won't admit how many years ago, but many years ago, much of the work actually then was very much focused around, I suppose, verifying the experience, just understanding, is it really the case that, for instance, people might listen to music and perceive color, or is it really the case that they might hear words and experience tastes? But for me, when I first started, I was interested in a slightly different question, which was, I felt it was pretty clear and pretty evident that these experiences were valid and people were having them. But in talking with synesthetes, it became increasingly apparent that it wasn't necessarily just the synesthetic experience that they had. There was a much wider richness to their lives that maybe in the scientific realms we weren't capturing. By that I mean there were differences in some of the wider traits, their wider perception, even in scenarios where maybe there wasn't something that induced their synesthesia, they appeared, to be reporting some kind of difference. And some of those differences that we've been able to work on over the years and have identified, both my own research team, but also others around the world, are differences in things like personality, creativity, empathy, sensory sensitivity, and memory. And I will talk about some of these in a bit more detail as I go on. But just to allude to some of those, I mean, differences in personality, one of the common ones is a difference in openness to experience. And this is largely to do with, how intellectually curious people might be, or how appreciative of art and sensitive to beauty they might be. And often you can find, particularly in synesthetes that experience color, that you can find these differences in openness to experience traits. We don't know if synesthesia is the trigger for that, or maybe if you're more likely to be more open to experiences, you're more likely to be a synesthete. It's a relationship. We can't make causal inferences, but there are differences there. There's differences in things like perception and memory. So it's quite common, if you're a synesthete that experiences color, that your perception of color, you may have a better threshold for perceiving color than a non-synesthete, or a synesthete who experienced another sensation but not color. So for instance, if you compared a taste synesthete with a color synesthete, so someone who experiences color from their synesthesia with someone who experiences taste from their synesthesia, the person that experiences color will typically have a better perception of color than the person who experiences taste. And the person who experiences taste you would predict, have a better perception of taste, for example. And it's also similar for memory. So synesthetes that experience color will typically have a better memory for color, for instance. It's not necessarily better memory across the board. It's often quite connected to their synesthetic experience. But these kind of differences exist. And this talk really, as I say, is to reflect on these differences and try to also touch on a few areas of discrepancy and consider what they might mean for art. And I'm going to hone in on a few of them. I'm going to hone in on empathy. I'm going to talk to you a bit about creativity and a bit about sensory sensitivity. So I'm going to try and do that. I believe I've got 10 minutes left in my talk, so I'm going to try and do that in the next 10 minutes. So let's work through it as quick as we can and hopefully have time for questions. So with regards to empathy, Anton very kindly introduced work that we've been doing in my lab for a number of years now, which is with people who experience mirror touch synesthesia, also people that experience mirror pain synesthesia. And these are people who say that when they see somebody being touched, they feel a physical sensation of touch on their own body. Or if you're someone that has mirror pain synesthesia, if you see somebody in pain, you might feel a physical sensation of pain on your own body. So in essence here, it's thought to be synesthetic because it's vision evoking touch. It's an automatic experience, it's consistent, it also tends to co-occur with other types of synesthesia, and it's something which is slightly more different than what people without synesthesia might feel, because many of us might imagine if we saw somebody in pain, we might flinch, we might feel uncomfortable by it, but do we actually feel that physical sensation that directly corresponds to the experience we're seeing? That's the unusual part when it comes to things like mirror touch or mirror pain synesthesia. And over the years, we've been able to identify that these people's experiences are valid, they're real. You can see neurological differences, then biological differences that back that up. You can see behavioral differences that back that up. But they also extend to other domains, and one domain is empathy. And empathy is, in its simplest term, it's the capacity to share the feelings and experiences of others. And of course, when we talk about people who are literally feeling the tactile sensations of others, then you might see how that might draw a link with empathy. But of course, empathy is not just about sharing touch, it's about sharing emotions, it's about sharing a whole range of vicarious experiences. And we tend to find that people with mirror touch synesthesia will show differences in how emotionally reactive they are when it comes to empathy. And what we mean by this is if they see somebody upset, they tend to feel upset to a greater degree than maybe someone who doesn't have mirror touch synesthesia. They're not necessarily more accurate at that. We're not saying they're better at getting, they might see someone who's upset and think that they're upset, but actually they're happy. And maybe they might be sharing the sensation incorrectly, but they're more likely to share the sensation to a similar degree as what the person experiencing it is. This is one way in which mirror touch synesthesia has been really helpful to help us understand wider perception. But it's also a way in which it's been helpful to help us understand art, because over the years we've also worked with artists, particularly in relation to something called empathic art spectatorship. And this is really, it refers to the experience of engaging with art in a way that involves a kind of deep emotional connection. It's the kind of emotional response you might get from art. And it's also how maybe, I don't know, even if you might see an artwork, you might feel like you can almost embody it, right? You might stand in front of a structure and almost feel like that structure is changing your representation of your body, how your body feels. And people with mirror touch synesthesia appear to be more sensitive to some of these effects. And this is one way in which, this kind of vicarious perception may contribute to vicarious emotional reactions in artwork. That's one link, and happy to talk more about that in questions, but just to give the overview. If we're moving forward, I should say, though, in talking about mirror touch synesthesia, there is sometimes something that people do flag to me in conversations, which is there can sometimes be a perceived discrepancy in the literature, because on the one hand, we have this group of people who appear to show this kind of heightened emotional reactive empathy. But on the other hand, sometimes people draw relationships between things like synesthesia and autism. And some people view this as a conflict. I personally don't. And the reason I don't is it's simply that we're in these situations, we're discussing quite complex concepts and neurodivergences. And so you need to very carefully examine the nuance and the context of what you're talking about. Because when people talk about relationships between autistic experience and synesthesia, so synesthesia and autism, often those relationships or those similarities are about subcomponents of autistic experiences. And often they're connected to things like sensory sensitivity, so a kind of heightened sensory awareness, and a bias towards details in perception, so being quite focused in detailed perception. It's not so much the social domains of autism that people tend to draw out. So that, for me, isn't necessarily a conflict. And even if it was, it's also really important to know that wider work on autism and empathy has shown that this is a bit of a topic of debate, because if you look at, for instance, some of the work from Jeff Bird's lab, who's based at Oxford University and the University of Birmingham, the view there is it's slightly oversimplistic to claim that all autistic people show reduced empathy. Some show a heightened empathic response, but it's an overwhelming empathic response. So empathy is quite a difficult construct because it's a combination, you know, of a number of factors, and some of the considerations about the relationship between autism and empathy these days suggest it's more about comorbidities with other traits like alexithymia, which is a difficulty in identifying your own physical sensations and emotional sensations. And they also suggest it might be to do with how we're measuring empathy, because, you know, there is evidence suggesting that, you know, people, autistic people may well share, you know, what they think someone is experiencing, which in a sense is empathy, if it's sharing what you think someone is experiencing, but perhaps the labeling of what they're experiencing is not quite as accurate, and that might lead to some of the errors that people see, and people might map that out. So there's something in that, but that's a wider point. I just wanted to draw on it. But it does point to another factor, right, that people with colour synesthesia and other types of synesthesia, they do show this heightened perceptual sensitivity. And I alluded to this earlier, right? If you're a colour synesthete, you may well have a better perception of colour. There is a broader heightened sensory sensitivity that has been reported in synesthesia. And some people have connected this to other areas. You know, some have suggested it might, you know, the fact that synesthetes might perceive the world in different ways to non-synesthetes might serve as a catalyst, you know, for things like better creativity. It might make them more creative because they're perceiving the world differently, not just in terms of better perceptual sensitivity, but, you know, they're having these altered additional experiences, one sense connecting with the other. Maybe that might open their minds up to, you know, more wider associations and those kind of divergent thinking approaches for creativity. And there is some mixed evidence for this. There's a handful of studies that have looked at, if you test people, for instance, with colour synesthesia on their performance on creative tasks, do you find they differ to non-synesthetes? Well, that doesn't always play out. There are some tasks connected to forming remote associations where maybe it plays out, but it doesn't always replicate. Instead, what tends to come out is evidence that people with synesthesia tend to gravitate more towards creative professions. So you tend to see, you know, that there are more synesthetes working in the autistic domain, and we don't necessarily know why that is. We don't necessarily know if that makes the output that they produce in some way better or worse. We don't necessarily know. That's a very difficult question to really pin down. What is better or worse, I think, when it comes to artistic creation? I mean, that's a very subjective question. But there is this evidence that people might steer towards creative professions. And this is certainly one area of an association potentially between synesthesia, the arts, and arguably you might say creativity. And I think it's really interesting to hear from artists before this talk, to hear about how they're using creativity and synesthesia in their work. And I think that aligns with that line of thinking. So I've whizzed through a few examples there, and it was very much just to give you a snapshot to really act as a fuel for conversation. But what I'm really been trying to put across in this is, in that snapshot, just to say synesthesia it's a rich and it's a complex phenomenon, and it offers a really interesting window, I think, into the nature of perception, not just in terms of how we, you know, might perceive the synesthetic experience itself and what that might mean for consciousness, but also more broadly, I think it has implications for how we can understand things like social interaction, how we might understand how people engage and experience artworks, even things like creativity. And this really is a snapshot. There's lots of areas I could have spoken more about. That personality dimension is a really interesting question of, well, how does that play out? Because things like openness to experience has been connected to creativity. It's also been connected to many other traits and experiences as well that I haven't spoken about. But in short, you know, I think when we think about synesthesia, we should think about it as a real kind of fertile ground for creativity and expression. And, you know, that unique experience and those unusual, you know, or different, I should say, I suppose, dimensions, those wider traits connected to synesthesia can have a real interesting way for how people interpret the world, and potentially, when it comes to art and other areas, the way in which they engage with it. So thank you for listening. I will close us there, pretty much, I think, bang on 15 minutes, hopefully, and I look forward to your questions. Cheers.
Thank you very much for such an interesting, rich and structured presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions, so we are now ready to open the Q&A. anyone who has a question, please either raise your virtual hand or write down your question in the chat, and I'll introduce you to ask your question. And we traditionally begin the discussion, allowing our speakers first to comment on each other talks or maybe ask a question. Dasha, do you want to begin? Oh, you're mute. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, once again. So I had a few questions to Lucy. First of all, I'm wondering how. Well, have you ever thought of creating that model of, let's say, your mind calendar in 3D, like as a sculpture? Because that would make a lot of sense to me, for example. Like,
yeah, thanks, Dasha. I really enjoyed. Yeah, I just want to say I really enjoyed your presentation as well, and your work is really beautiful. It is something that we've discussed and kind of felt like it would be the next iteration if we were to pick this collaboration back up, because yes, it's currently dormant. But we kind of, yeah, I mean, it just seemed kind of open-ended. We thought about panels of glass that you could walk through, hanging, maybe hanging silks or light projections. I had this one idea that I got really into, which Daniel was a little skeptical about, which was that you could kind of fly through a zip line through the
wow.
It's like really exciting, because I think it's just yeah, a big part of it is immersion, or the feeling of immersion and embodiment, and bringing your body into it. So it's not just something that is like, again, abstracted or distanced, because one of the things I've come to really articulate for myself about the kind of synesthesia I experience is that it's a constant attempt to make abstraction tangible and sensorial. So my brain is kind of trying to translate all abstract symbology into a material sensorial experience. So as an artist, then I should be making that even more, like you say, like a physical installation and not just something that's flat on the wall. So it is something, but it's very open-ended.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question. So when you were saying, like, describing the whole way how you perceive the calendar and time, it's very different from mine. I also do. I think I have a more typical way of. I even read about that kind of way in Wikipedia. I think that many people with synesthesia have this kind of a perception. So mine is kind of flat, but yours, you're like floating through it. And when you were describing your way, I just had some ideas that maybe the way I perceive the calendar influences my ability to plan, for example, or like especially like long-term planning, because I never see past 1 year, for example. It just doesn't. It just wants not circle, but kind of like a rectangular shape with. So, but you see like the years and centuries, and that's so. My question would be, do you think that this perception somehow influences your way of like functioning in the world in respect of time, like timing, I don't know, maybe your projects, or like just planning your day, or like maybe memories, you perceive them somehow differently? I mean, yeah,
Well,
it's quite detailed.
so interesting that you see it as well. Yeah, I'm always so curious how other people visualize it. For me, it is very much this undulating wave that I'm always kind of riding and flowing with, and zooming in and zooming out. And I would say it definitely dominates my almost entire consciousness. I'm constantly located in a place of time and considering the far future, the next week, the next year. I'm seeing it. I'm kind of placing things along it. I'm taking things away as things change, but I'm also always like reflecting backwards. And a lot of my artistic work, I'm often researching ancient history, and I'm really interested in kind of pushing the visual limits of my perception of ancient history and building that out as well in my brain. And then I'm not often as concerned with the distant future because that just feels so open, but I've found that I really like to locate things in the past that aren't just my personal past, but are kind of like this idea of a past. And I have noticed that I start to see things as more circular and less linear as I've built that out. Whereas when I was a child, it felt more that there was like a future and a past, and I was like very conditioned to orient that way. And I've opened up that perspective. But I think it's also a limitation in some ways that I get very I'm like, I need that kind of almost like control of what's coming up next week or what's coming up in a year. How can I hook onto the flow that I'm feeling instead of just that openness? So I wouldn't say it's like a major struggle, but it is something that I'm aware of is deeply impacting me and operating for sure. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I have two questions to Michael. It's maybe I will put them as one. First of all, I was wondering what brought you to synesthesia. Maybe you mentioned, but I missed it. So if that's the case, please excuse me. And then what do you see the implications of the studies of synesthesia? Like what are possible goals that you're trying to reach with your research, and maybe what kind of hopes you have for like when the research progresses, like what can be, I don't know, improved in lives of people or something?
It's a great question. So as to what brought me to synesthesia, initially, I mean, I'm interested, my research is really interested in how people perceive and interact with the world around them. And I've always been interested in consciousness as well as a wider theme. So when I first came across mirror touch synesthesia, I was like, wow, this is incredible, because you've got this amazing blend of an unusual conscious experience of the world and, you know, it allows me to look at how people interpret and interact with the world around them. That was the initial driver. Over the years, with hindsight, maybe I look back and think about it differently, because I found out about 5 or 6 years into studying synesthesia that I have synesthesia, so maybe I was actually driven to it somehow without realizing, because I didn't realize it was a type of synesthesia, but I'm still not sure I believe it is, because I have
what kind?
ticker tape. So, you know, when you see these kind of words and letters when people speak, you kind of see like a newsreel, and it's, yeah, and some people don't think that's a synesthesia, and because I have it, I'm maybe biased to think, well, surely everybody has that, right? So I don't know, but so maybe in hindsight that played out, but to go into the second part of where we hope to go with it, I mean, there's many ways, but I think particularly with the mirror touch and the mirror pain work, I mean, one of the things we've been able to learn in that experience is by understanding how people have these altered empathic reactions in this, we've been able to start thinking about ways in which we might be able to train people without synesthesia to be able to regulate their empathic reactions, because the broad theme of this, it connects to your ability to distinguish between yourself and somebody else and control those representations. And in a number of professions like healthcare, having high empathy can be really beneficial, but can also be incredibly draining and potentially a cause of professional burnout. So from the work in mirror touch synesthesia, we've actually led to developing training in people without synesthesia that we're now working with in care professions to try to think about. And it all stems back to that work. So for me, it's been a really beautiful journey with that. And for me, that's the real thing for synesthesia, is I think there's ways it can help inform not just the understanding of synesthetic mind, but also other elements of the world. And I could have picked design as another example with color synesthesia if that was useful, but that empathy one has been particularly personally important for me throughout my career.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. So if our speakers have no more questions, I'll begin asking the audience. But just before we do that, I have a question for Dasha. Dasha, you mentioned in your project, Synthetic Letters, that the human body is important. Can you maybe extend a little bit on that? What role does it play?
Well, it's just important maybe for the whole body of my work. I usually always place a human figure in any piece, I have just like very few without a human figure, and I think, but those pieces, they're not actually portraits. I cannot refer to them as portraits. Most of them are about the combination of the human figure and the environment, less so maybe in the Synaesthetic Letters project. But I think if I try to rationalize this, I think it's my attempt to humanize whatever experience I'm trying to project on this into this particular piece, and also to help people, the viewers of my work, associate themselves with the piece. So whenever we see some human figures, it's to my mind, it's just easier to kind of place yourself in that kind of a circumstance and understand, okay, this is how it might feel. So that's
Great. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah. So we have a question from Anna. Anna, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. This is a question for Dr. Vanessy. I'm wondering, for mirror synesthetes, in your experience, if you can answer this, is it common for them to experience emotional confusion? And by that I mean having difficulty distinguishing between one's own emotions and emotions that one is sort of internalizing from other people. As somebody who recently found out that I have a form of mirror sensory synesthesia, this is my experience, and I'm wondering how common it is.
It's a good question. We don't know exactly how common it is, and there's quite a bit of variability in it in terms of different like all types of synesthesia. There's a lot of variability within it. We do know that typically people with mirror sensory synesthesia will experience unusual self-other blurring, so they'll be more likely to map other people's experiences, other people's bodies onto their own. So even seeing someone's body in a position you expect your body to be in, they might be more likely to incorporate that and think it's their own body. So there'd be some evidence that would suggest it might play out. But in most cases, I think people do typically, although they will be sharing the emotion, they will still be able to say, well, this is their emotion, this is my emotion, but I'm feeling their emotion substantially more than my own. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that element of knowing it's yours and theirs. There's a distinction in that. Yeah. And then are you taking on their feelings more than your own? That tends to be where the challenge sets in.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question from Tim. Tim, please go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for those really interesting talks and presentations. And I have a question, and I think Lucy's comment about her way of seeing things and thinking about time being something as an organizational tool, it seemed like, made me think about a question actually to ask Dr. Vanessy in regards to how synesthesia develops over a person's lifetime in regards to creative practice as well. So if we can make a small assumption here that perhaps synesthesia is more common in younger people, or more, let's just say that maybe it becomes less so as people get older. If you are interested in it as a useful tool, perhaps as a creative or an organizational tool, is it something that you might self-nurture as a human being? That makes sense. I don't know if I made myself clear, but I was thinking Lucy sounds like she uses her synesthesia to help her manage time. Artists, obviously, if they've got a perception that is interesting, may tap into that and nurture it. So is it possible that that's one of the reasons we might see it more in creatives, or we might say that creatives often have more attention to the perception? Can you self-nurture it? Could it be something that is self-nurtured and then therefore maintained, while others who don't find it useful might lose the understanding or the relevance, and then therefore might fall away, might be pruned somehow. So I hope my question made some sense.
No, it made sense, and I think it was directed to me initially. So I'll start, but the others might want to come in on it from a more lived experience perspective as well. But so the short answer from the science is we don't know, which is the unfortunate thing in terms of much of the science of synesthesia focuses on the adult side of things rather than on the developmental trajectory. I mean, there is some exceptions to that, particularly Jules Simner's work. In that, there is evidence that, there are potentially more synesthetic, or there's more fluidity in synesthetic associations when children of synesthetes are quite young, and those start to become more fine-grained as they reach certain developmental points. But that doesn't quite get at your question, Tim, which I think is about why do some synesthetes use their synesthesia in some ways and others not? And I think that's a really interesting question because, Lucy's example of using the kind of timeline, that's something I've come across with a number of different synesthetes, but I've also come across synesthetes that have times who just say they don't use it, it's just there, so there's those dynamics. And what if we were to then, if we know that some people do them, we know there are some strategies, what if we were to train people or offer people those strategies, would they start to do them? The closest analogy to that I can think about is where some people have tried to use things like coloured calculators for synesthetes that have number colour synesthesia to try to facilitate calculation with mixed outcomes, actually. So this is why it's kind of hard to give you the scientific data to back that one up. But that's a first stab. I don't know if that's a helpful answer, and if anyone else wants to back me up.
Yeah, I can jump in and say that, first of all, I think about that a lot because I was really lucky to go to a Waldorf Steiner school, which I don't know if anyone knows that kind of alternative education, but it's extremely artistic and creative, extremely rooted in form and color. And I think that very much encouraged my early childhood brain to kind of deepen and expand and nurture my synesthesia completely unintentionally. And I always think, oh, I don't know, it could have been stamped out. I think that a lot of the kind of like mainstream culture doesn't encourage synesthesia necessarily. So some people are probably struggling with that. And then I also felt lucky that I became aware that I had it at around 18 or 19. And I wonder if I hadn't become aware that I had it until a much later age, would I have nurtured it also? Because once I realized it was a thing, I started to think about it a lot more. I started to articulate it to other people and myself. And then the third question that I guess also kind of it struck with me is that one I wanted, it's already been kind of talked about a bit, but could someone who doesn't have synesthesia at all actually learn to think that way or teach themselves to have those associations and expand kind of like perceptive capacity? So I think it's a really interesting question, and something that is worth considering for sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We had a question from Mamoru. Do you want to ask a question? Please go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for amazing talk. I have two questions, and one for Lucy and Dasha. The engagement with the art changed your synesthesia, for instance, helping articulating your synesthetic experience or something. And my second question is perhaps I think for Daniel as well, but I was wondering if you both translating your synesthetic experience into the art, and are there any, let's say, synesthetic elements that hardly captured in the process of making an art? So some experience that is hard to express in the paintings or perhaps photo shootings or making a sculpture. So those are my questions. Hope that makes sense.
Danielle, Lucy? For some reason, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was muted, sorry. So, I mean, of course, I don't have synesthesia, so I'm more of a conduit. So there's definitely I guess maybe the limitations of my abilities, and also the limitations of the materials that thus far we've been using in order to translate, and also the limitations between our ability to communicate, and for Lucy to distill her experience into words that then can then be translated into a visual form. So there's like a lot of moments where there's barriers in these communications through oral to physical. So it is definitely always a challenge to try and make those translations. And I think we've often spoken about having a moment to like doing an artist residency together, where we would only be focusing on how to create these different modes of expression to translate the synesthetic. I think that's something we would like to explore. But thus far we've stuck to painting, and yeah, I think we are curious about other forms. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, but still we have some time for a question from Susanna. Please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, that's a good start. Thank you for all of your different presentations. I really enjoyed them. I've got a question for Michael, actually, because I did a little bit of research into synesthesia, and from what I understand, there's like inherent synesthesia, which is like it comes very, very early in the perceptual process, and then there's learnt synesthesia, which is the synesthesia that comes from when like numbers, letters, days, months are attached, so that they are different timeframes when this happens. So first of all, the research I did was ages ago, so I might be outdated. So that was my first question. But the second was, if that is still understood to be the case, is there a difference, or is there anything about the character, personality, creativity stuff that goes with when that happens, the synesthetic connections, if you like? So that's one of my questions.
Yes, great question. So, so we tend to think about developmental synesthesia as being that that's present from early childhood, right? Typically when we talk about learnt synesthesia, currently people will actually tend to be thinking about where sometimes people have tried to train people to have synesthetic-like associations, and there is evidence that extensive training can induce synesthetic-like behaviors. There's a slight distinction in that, because just because it appears like doesn't necessarily mean it is the same mechanisms as synesthesia to get there, right? And you can also acquire synesthesia after brain injury sometimes as well. So sometimes people can, or even acquired sight loss and things like that can lead to changes. So there are ways it can be acquired later in life. But a lot of the work really that I've been talking about is more these developmental cases of synesthesia. And it's fair to say that, you know, there are some people who would argue that you can identify evidence of synesthesia and cross-modal links very soon after birth. It's very hard to totally label those as synesthesia, because you can't necessarily get always the reports from a newborn infant, right? But things like language, like letter color synesthesia, naturally there has to be a learning component, because you have to learn the language, but people would still argue that that's a developmental synesthesia, because it's there. You've kind of got you've got the architecture neurologically and biologically to scaffold on top of. It's not necessarily that the language itself is doing that. So the language almost gives you the environment for the synesthesia to express itself. But the idea would be that the actual underlying biology of it, that genetic kind of inheritance, is there already, and it's almost that epigenetic factor, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but from my understanding, there's a massive variation in how that happens. So from some person, it might just be just days of the week and they're a set color.
Exactly.
And for other people, it changes over time, so over decades. And for other people, it's like Lucy's immersion of like everything is changed by it.
So
and you know, like, sorry.
Yeah, there's lots of variety between people. Even within the same family, you might have, let's say, two siblings, and one person may express as a letter to colour synesthete, someone else might be words to sounds, right? So it's really hard to quite pin down what's driving it. So you can get that, and you can get this fluidity. I mean, historically in science, there's been a bit of an obsession of saying consistency as a hallmark of synesthesia, but that's also partly because scientifically that makes it easier to study. I think if someone was in front of me personally who was having these atypical sensory experiences, they met all of the other things, but they just weren't consistent in their mappings. Would I say they're not a synesthete? I wouldn't personally, but I know a number of scientists who would really be tearing their hair out of me for saying that right now. But there is this nuance to it that does get unpacked. Yeah.
Because what I was interested in the more normal is a terrible word, but if you see the more normal perception, like that we all share, so that you can say, oh, well, this person has this sort of highly defined synesthetic experience, but actually most of us have some form of synesthetic experience or connection, because, you know, that kind of connection for everyone is very accessible, or can be, the more we know about it.
Yes.
So I suppose you were talking about whether it's possible to learn synesthesia. So I suppose my question is, how much is known about the stuff that kind of early, you were saying that it's really hard to find babies who will give you good evidence, but, you know, like, surely if you look at the brain reaction under a scan and you make a noise and the baby's visual cortex goes and on the auditory, surely you can say, well, we know that X amount of babies have got this reaction. I don't know if it's even, do you know what I'm trying to think?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky to do with the methods, and not necessarily, because actually your visual cortex still has cells that respond to other sensory stimuli as well. It's just vision is dominant. So you need to be mindful of that. And we also will have, your earlier point is more that we all kind of have cross-modal correspondences. So for all of us, you know, we'll associate certain shapes with certain sounds, certain bright lights and so forth. And absolutely, if you look at synesthetic experiences, you tend to find synesthetes will typically have, I don't know, like dark colors might go with low tones and bright colors might go with high tones, right? And that's partly because, you know, people with synesthetes, they live in the same world we all do. We're all learning these associations around us. So there's layers to that. But yeah, I'm mindful I'm answering a lot, and there might be others that might want to come in, so I don't want to hog the floor.
Thank you very much. Dasha, I can see your hand is raised. Do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I do. I actually have kind of the question that will maybe continue this topic. That would be to Michael, and it's a little bit connected with what Lucy just said. So, is there any kind of a research or that you know of that synesthesia or the development of it is somehow influenced by the environment and like the upbringing? Like Lucy said that she was attending that special school where her sensory perceptions were developed, and I also think that, like, now again taking a new perspective on it, it might like the way I was brought up and trained sort of about the calendars might have influence on the way how this works for me. And also the second question would be, if people, again, maybe there's some kind of a research, if people find out about having synesthesia quite early in life, like when, let's say when they're like even like 7 or 8, does it help them to develop it kind of more, or does it influence the experience in any way? Because again, from getting back a little bit to my project, my collaborator, she knew about her experience, and that was a thing from early childhood, and she's like, yeah, that was so that was so simple for me to remember all the codes, all the numbers, like telephone numbers back when you had to remember them, and people's names and so on. And she's like, yeah, I was using that all the time. And her parents were disagreeing with that experience for some reason. So it's kind of tricky. So I guess I hope that my questions make sense.
yeah, perfectly clear. I'll try and tackle it super quickly because I'm mindful of time for everybody as well. So around knowledge or awareness, I'm not aware of any research on that where if someone was more aware of it as a child, has that changed relative to a child who was less aware of it? I can't comment on that. Around environment, there have been studies over the year looking at how different environments may impact synesthetic development, but a lot of this has been more to do with, particularly in relation to, let's say, grapheme color synesthesia, so letters to colors, looking at what makes the colors have their associations. So there are some studies that, for instance, have done things and looked at things like how different fridge magnets, because you might get these colored fridge magnets sometimes, and how that might play out. But that doesn't actually explain all of the associations you see, because for others, you know, even though they might have grown up with those kind of dynamics, it doesn't then align in that way. And you might find that similar sounding letters have similar colors, or similar shaped letters have different colors. When I was looking at your alphabet, I was kind of trying to map that out as well. So, I mean, but going back to the point, I mean, I think we have to acknowledge environment has to have some role in synesthesia, because even down to, if you're going to, for instance, have word color synesthesia, you've got to learn language, you've got to learn. So there's an interaction in that, but how much of an effect it is versus other factors, we're less clear on. And I think the question about Lucy's, you know, the kind of schooling and that I don't know of any studies that have really looked at those types of environments at that level. So hopefully that helps. A quick summary.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. There was a question from Sean Day, but I can't see it anymore. So if you have a question, yeah, we have time just for a very short question or comment. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if we have time. This is for Michael Benessy. I think I've raised this with you beforehand, but regarding mirror touch, have you done, or do you know of other people who have done experiments regarding mirror touch using androids, or let's say looking at allo animals such as dogs or cats?
Not that I'm immediately aware of. We have done things where we've played around with objects, which isn't quite Android. So we've used things like lamps and stuff like this, and there are people that do get mirror touch sensations from that, and it becomes increasingly more likely for people to get that if we interlace those objects with people. So if people start to almost see the object where they expect a person to be, so it's almost like it takes that personification side to it. Self-reported, there's hopefully, I imagine, some mirror touch synesthesia. You might want to give some views on that, because some people do report it for different species. Some do report it for androids. Some people actually say no with an android, and there's an uncanny valley situation that starts to kick in, and it becomes not quite right. And so there's dynamics in that. CC's nodding, so I don't know if CC wants to come in.
I mean, that's why that's what I'm wondering about. Is it's like, just like, on average, where is the cutoff for an android, or where is the cutoff for an allo animal? How how domesticated, how familiar? Related to that, just like real quick, right? Also, looking at something like, for instance, and I've raised this before, and I know Cece's going to probably be bothered if she's here. I've raised it before. Things such as zombie movies, where it's obviously an actor, obviously fake or such like that, right? How cheesy does the movie have to be before the mirror synesthete doesn't really, because it's just too fake or too comical? It's like where's the cutoff for, if right, mirror synesthete watching one of these zombie movies, do they feel the effect or don't they feel the effect?
I think it's really interesting, and we played around a bit with the perception of animacy and this kind of, you know, uncanny valley. And the challenge is, I don't think it's as simple as saying here's the cutoff, because people have such variability in what their cutoff is before it even then becomes, you know, even if you don't have mirror touch synesthesia, right? If I was to show you something that merges between a real human to an android, and I ask you, where does it change? That's going to vary between everybody on this room, just to say, is it a real human or not? And that then plays out in terms of, so there's a threshold point, but how it impacts the synesthesia, you know, that becomes a whole other layer, which, yeah, I don't know, Cece might want to talk to this, because I'm...
Yeah, please go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute myself. So Michael, it's great to see you. And just a couple of quick comments about what Sean said. And Michael, the conversation you just had, the more anthropomorphic an android is, the more likely I am to have mirror sensory phenomena with it. Even those dog-like robots that have 4 appendages and walk like quadrupeds, I'll still map them on my body with both my arms and my legs. Multi-tentacled android or robotic vehicles, I'm more likely to feel them as sensation on my skin and not movement in my limbs. Which brings me to a comment that I wanted to make, which is not so much a question. With Dasha's artwork, because it is, you know, human bodies representing the letters, I get a very strong mirror sensory phenomena from looking at the shapes of those bodies and the way that they're positioned. So it becomes this lovely sort of meta experience of seeing both Dasha's letters in color, but then also having them map as physical sensations on my very mirror sensory body. So Dasha, I've admired your work for quite a while. It was great to hear you speak today. And to all of the artists, I'm really just delighted that I got to be present for this, and that our organization, IASIS, got to work with Marina in organizing such a wonderful talk today.
Thank you so very much. Yes, so we are running out of time. I want to thank everyone, our speakers, our incredible speakers, and the audience. The questions were so interesting. Thank you very much for this discussion. And this was the last seminar this year, but next year in January, we are having our final seminar on high cuisine and synesthesia. So please join us then. And we just wish you the rest of the day, a very great rest of the day, and end of the year holidays as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting.
Thank you so much.